Hello, I'm Estelle Matthews and welcome to Food for Thought, the show that invites thought leaders and experts from the food industry to share their insights on sustainability. Meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of tomorrow brings its own challenges, questions and opportunities. But putting people and planet at the heart of the food industry is essential for a sustainable world and business. We'll be hearing from people from all areas of food retail and grocery who've been making strides in sustainability, leading change from the front and inspiring others to do so. Join us as we listen to a variety of stories and perspectives that are food for thought.
The consumer is becoming much more aware of sustainability agenda. How do we look after our planet?
Sustainability doesn't always necessarily have to translate into a more expensive product on the shelf. The more resources that you save, the more efficient you are, the less money you spend and the more profitable you are.
Don't be too hard on ourselves for the decisions we made in the past. Make sure that as we go forward in the future, it's a better solution.
Global food prices rose in 2020 in the wake of COVID-19 lockdowns and soared last year as markets reacted to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of grain and oilseeds. Now in 2024, food and drink prices remain high and are contributing to an extended cost of living crisis globally. Today, I'm joined by NSF's Lisa Spicker and Alison Friel to discuss what the cost of living crisis means for consumers, food retailers and grocery organisations in their approach to sustainability and efforts to go green. Let's start by hearing more about our guests. Lisa, please tell us about your background and what led you to doing the work that you do today.
Well, really, I've been working in the food business my entire working career. And I started out with organic certification. I have a lot of experience with food manufacturing and general management, and definitely sustainability consulting and management, and just really making sure we understand how the food system connects globally and how to be able to integrate sustainability throughout that.
Alison, what about you? What led you to care so much about food and sustainability?
Like Lisa, I've been in the food industry all my career. Started out in manufacturing, and then I've moved into both retail and hospitality. So for me, it's about providing good, safe food for everyone to consume, and also enjoying it, because sometimes we get a little bit too much into the technical stuff when ultimately as a consumer people want to enjoy what they eat and hopefully feel the passion from those that work in the industry making those products.
That's so interesting you talk about feeling the passion, because it does feel like with the current climate, we forget that actually food can be interesting and fun and is something that we can all share together.
Yeah, I mean, do you go out to eat or you eat at home? If you enjoy what you're cooking and preparing, then it makes eating it even more enjoyable.
Let me start by asking, what do we mean by sustainability?
Well, of course, there's the definition that was created by the Brundtland Commission, who worked with the UN in, I think it was 1986, to create a definition. And that's about, being able to meet the needs of today without compromising our ability to meet the needs for tomorrow. But practically speaking, brands need to decide what's important to them. And that might sound almost capricious, but it's not, because every business's business model is different. Their consumers are different. Their products are different. Their home location and headquarters is different. All of these have impacts on what is going to be important to them. A great doorway concept around sustainability for perhaps people who are still a little bit suspect or not necessarily sure if it's a good thing or not, or if they believe in it, is in so many ways environmental sustainability is about, having efficient resource consumption. And that's going to speak to even the most traditional operations manager or manufacturer, right? Because the more resources that you save, the more efficient you are, the less money you spend and the more profitable you are, right? So you're looking at energy used, you're looking at fossil fuels used, you're looking at water, you're looking at energy, you're looking at waste, right? Like, making sure you're managing those and not having waste around that is one of the most important things you can do as a company. And then that will reduce emissions and so on and so forth. And then it gets, of course, there's more layers after that. But I think that's an easy way to look at it. And then socially speaking, you want to make sure you're taking care of people that you're working with. And that means either your direct employees or the supply chain. And I like putting animals in the social piece because, they're their own type of living being with feelings and emotions. And, you want to even if they're ultimately being put into a food, like how can you make that life worth living in the meantime, and make that a good environment for them.
Alison, you've had experience both in the regulatory field, but also 10 years experience working for one of the big brand supermarkets in the UK. So does sustainability mean something slightly different for you?
I think not necessarily just working at the retailer. I think for me personally, it's about how can we do everything better? And if we keep trying to do it better, then we'll get to that utopia of we'll have a complete sustainable planet, and we can all go, we've got another 200, 300, 400,000 years left. I think we've all got to take our own responsibility and do what we can in our own ways, and then also within our organisations. So I talk about making sure I do my shopping so that I don't have waste at the end of the week. I translate that into the workplace in terms of when we're producing products, how do we make it with the least waste possible all the way through. So probably the practical application of the little bits that we do that build up to the big changes that help protect both ourselves, our planet, our futures.
Lisa, let's just ask you about the cost of living and how it's contributed to the downturn in consumers making more sustainable choices. Has it had a real impact? Are consumers still actually prepared to pay more for kind of genuine green innovation?
I think you see study after study and choice after choice that indicates that consumers who can do continue to maybe spend just a little bit more on more sustainable products. Sustainability doesn't always necessarily have to translate into a more expensive product on the shelf, but unfortunately, a lot of times it does. But I think that you just see so many people committed to trying to create a better world, have a cleaner environment, have more socially responsible food. And they just don't necessarily want to take no for an answer with that. So I think we'll see people continue to vote with their dollars as much as they can and really try to raise the volume of those types of products that are being sold, which ultimately can help make that price more affordable.
Following up on that, Lisa, with socially responsible food, this is something I'm personally interested in because I'm vegan. Although I'm doing it for certain reasons, I want to make sure that I'm also doing it for the planet. So we all know that vegan diets tend to be lower in secondary carbon emissions, but can you just explain a little bit more about whether or not this is the case?
Well, you're putting, someone where science always has to be the backbone of conclusions, right? In a little challenging situation to say, okay, well, tell me, is this always the case? Why is it always the case, right? There's always an it depends, especially when you're looking at the life cycle science really behind food. But generally speaking, you do see trends where perhaps more protein intense foods can have higher carbon emissions and higher resource use just in general. So a lot of times that does lean towards animal proteins, but it can be other, protein, anything that gets more and more processed, you have a lot more resource use in that.
Eating a plant-based diet, is there something that really is causing these secondary carbon emissions, or are we safe with all plants?
Well, the answer is no, you're not safe with all plants, but I'm going to broaden your question actually to address some concerns beyond carbon emissions, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. There can be a lot of products that are associated with agricultural practices that could potentially be contributing to deforestation, for example, or have other types of impacts beyond carbon. So sustainability really is a web. When you're looking at grains, vegetables, a lot of them, they seem to have a little bit lower overall carbon footprint. And yes, there's a lot of studies that show that beef, for example, which is one of the biggest life forms that are out there that we eat, do have a higher signature. But, again, a lot of times it really depends. And there's types of beef that might have a much lower carbon emission because of management practices that they have, rotational grazing and practices like that can look after the welfare of the animal as well as help to regenerate the pasture lands in which they're grazing. So it is kind of a big, it depends.
Thank you. Alison, recent reports have suggested that there's a growing eco-fatigue and that in fact it's the cost of living crisis that's one of the top reasons for the decline in both veganism and sustainability. What do you say to that, especially from a supermarket perspective?
I think there's, as Lisa said, if people want it, they will still buy it. I think there's people have to balance their desire for plant-based or alternatives or what they can afford. And I think, in times of cost of living crisis, as we are at the moment, people will dial back, maybe not in all areas, but they might make some choices. So I think the market is still growing, but maybe not as quick, and it's not as explosive as it was. But
how are you seeing the supermarkets responding, though?
I think they're marketing it better. They're giving more choice. If you look at sort of 10, 15 years ago, the choice was quite limited. I think also the products, they're much more enjoyable to eat as a consumer. Do you want a plant-based food that replicates meat, or do you want something that's a complete alternative? So there are different product types that we can produce as industry. But I think it's slowed, it's still growing, and I think as people recover and the economy recovers, then those markets will grow again.
And there's much more interesting marketing happening. Branding is looking great, isn't it?
And it's a lot more front of store. If you go back 10, 15 years, if you wanted anything other than your standard product, it was in the corner at the back or a short promotion. Now it's front and centre, so it will be next to the meat, properly segregated and things like that, but it will be available so that even those that people are choosing to not have meat every day, meat-free days, so you don't have to go totally vegan or totally vegetarian to bring some of that balance. And I think the supermarkets and all the shops are responding to that.
Lisa, is there a kind of global difference? If we look around the different countries, is there a difference in the way supermarkets are responding to this branding and this availability of more sustainable or even plant-based food?
I think a lot of the branding, the marketing, the positioning, the product mix that you're seeing really depends on the socioeconomic conditions at a national and then the subnational level. I think that's really important. A lot of times we see very eco-conscious consumer regulations coming out of European continent, from the EU, UK, and then you see that start trickling down and influencing perhaps some regulations, practices, consumer demands in North America. And then a lot of times the global South ends up having to respond to that because of supply chain pressures. But a lot of times you see these more sustainable options being exported. You're not necessarily seeing that be put on the shelves. Now, does that mean it's not on the shelves? No, that's not what that means. But I do think that you see it being fewer, because you see the majority of, for example, organic sales happening between Europe and North America very clearly, versus compared to other regions in the world. So that socioeconomic status and the ability to really buy some of these products that, even if they're grown locally and sold locally, they still would have a higher price tag. It's in general a little bit more price sensitive consumer.
Alison, in terms of supermarkets and whether or not they're profiteering potentially from the cost of living crisis, there's been loads in the media about this at the moment, and it might be that supermarkets are getting a hard time. But what can supermarkets do to change these perceptions, do you think?
I think it's being a bit more open and transparent about how those products get to market. There's no doubt that when you innovate and bring new products to market, there is a cost to those products, and then when you get scale, that cost can be brought back. There's a lot of pressure now, certainly in the UK, to avoid putting too much promotion on food that's seen as not as healthy. Plant-based alternatives can be seen as healthy, but there's a balance to be had. We can go a lot wider in the discussion, but ultimately the supermarkets, they're doing a lot of work around trying to provide meal solutions that are affordable. Profiteering, well, it's commercial enterprise, so they are going to make money, otherwise they won't exist. And I think we'll probably say it quite a few times throughout this conversation, is it's about balancing where we are and where we're heading.
And picking up on ultra-processed food, is this something that supermarkets are very aware of in terms of labelling? Of course, this all links with the kind of green side of things, doesn't it?
I think everything's intertwined. The ultra-processed food is quite a hot topic at the moment, but I don't think it's as simple as processed food is the worst thing in the world. We can look back to, when I was at school, we learnt how to cook. We don't necessarily have that education as much. People are more time pressured. My mum didn't work, so I came home to a home-cooked meal every night. That's not the situation and not the case for a lot of people now. So I don't think it's as simple as let the evil ultra-processed, everything has its place.
Well, I think you see a lot of grocery stores and large retailers, whether it's Marks and Spencer or whether it's Whole Foods, and a lot of others, not just them. They actually are making their own banned ingredients lists so that if you're buying products from that store or from that manufacturer, that you can count on the fact that there's not a certain chemical or other type of ingredient in there that might be found offensive or concerning. And just kind of playing off what Allison's saying about is ultra processed, is that really going to be defined anytime soon? Probably not. But I do think that you see brands, whether it's, again, a retailer or if it's a manufacturer, saying, this is what we stand for. This is what you can trust us with. So I know when I walk into that store, even if I do buy something that's in a box that I'm going to warm up on the stove or pop in the oven or something like that, I know that I'm not going to necessarily be eating something that's offensive to me or I consider a concern for my diet.
That brings us on to talking about how brands and supermarkets can simplify broader things for consumers, especially if a lot of people are interested in getting the kind of green label right. Perhaps it's a traffic light system, etc. Any thoughts on that?
I think there's only so much space you can put on a pack. When we brought in traffic light labelling, which is going back some years now, there was a time where the retailers were all doing their own thing. It's now become standardised in industry, so that makes that easier for the consumer. I think when we're talking about the sustainability messaging, it's about being clear to the consumer, because you can't put your policy on packs. You've got to find a way of getting that message about the welfare standards of the meat that's in your product, or whether it's organic and these things. We've got to find ways, because the packs are getting really crowded. So for a consumer to make a choice, they need to be able to find the information they're interested in quite quickly. And as Lee said, if you walk into a store and you understand what the brand of that store is and what their ethos is, that's something that doesn't necessarily need to all be on pack, but then you can highlight some of the messaging in the pack copy that you then produce.
Currently, it's all a bit overwhelming. Is that what you think, Lisa?
I have an advantage, and I've spent my entire professional career navigating certifications and sustainability claims. So I not only don't feel overwhelmed, I critique the claims that I do see and decide which ones I think are bad or actually mean something.
Tell us about the bad ones.
Oh, well, that's kind of subjective in a way, right? Having worked in the organic industry in the past, I'm just such a passionate believer in organic. I feel like, ensuring that we're using agricultural systems that are not introducing persistent toxic pesticides and other inputs into our environment is just a critical way for us to live. And we can find ways to meet the demands for our growth, right, by using more organic practices that aren't going to be polluting our environment. So, you just have to decide what's important, and also how can you afford, right? Or what can you afford, I should say, because sometimes I might go ahead and buy a non-GMO oil, even though I know that means it might be conventionally grown with chemical inputs that I wouldn't necessarily want to have in my local environment. But I know it's at least non-GMO and on the path towards where I would like to see my ideal product be that I can afford.
And do you think some people mistake organic, for example, for sustainable?
Well, I think organic is sustainable. You might find other people who don't agree necessarily, and that's in part why the regenerative agriculture movement has come about, because ultimately, even though it's a huge win to get any type of practice written into a national standard or law, like in the United States, European Union, and in many other countries across the world, it also limits the dynamism that can accompany sort of a growing, changing, evolving standard and production system. And some people think, well, if you follow the letter of the law for USDA NOP, maybe it isn't necessarily as sustainable as you might think. Maybe you still can run an agricultural system and the environment around that into the ground. And so that's where the regenerative has come in on top of that. But, when you're really looking at the spirit of organic, the way the standards are written, and just the practices that it really requires of you with having crop rotations and, making sure you're really looking out for the health of the land, I think that, organic can be sustainable. But there will be a healthy debate out there about that.
Alison, do you share that? Do you share that view?
I'm more of the manufacturing side, so I can see why you will get more efficiency in some areas, and I think that's where the sustainability debate comes in. Is it more sustainable to be able to produce more but it's not organic, or is it better for the planet if it's organic? So I think it comes back to those trade-offs. There isn't a simple answer, and it's about, what are your brand values? What do you stand for as an organisation? And then do the best that you can to meet that aspiration and take it forward, and be prepared to change as science changes, because that's the other thing, is what we know today in 25 years, I hope I'll be retired, but in that sort of time we will move and we will evolve and things will change. And don't be too hard on ourselves for the decisions we made in the past. Make sure that as we go forward in the future, it's a better solution, because we've all been in products that 20 years ago that was the best thing, and now we go, actually wouldn't make it that way. We wouldn't do the same thing. Look at the amount of salt, fat, sugar reduction we've been working on as an industry for the last few years, certainly in the UK and into Europe, and probably starting to happen in the States as well now. There's much more interest in how do we make those products as nutritionally sound as possible, whereas 30 years ago it was, here's a product, isn't it great, it's exciting. It's
a kind of never-ending journey, but it seems to be moving much, much faster now than ever before, which is a good thing. Lisa?
Well, I think Alison has a great point where it's just continuously evolving. And I really like your statement of let's not condemn the past too much. For the most part, people, scientists, leaders, for the most part, really are trying to make better decisions. And so condemning things happening now is ultimately just perpetuating a pattern of then what we're doing now will also be condemned in the future, right? So celebrating the learning that we've had, and keeping moving forward.
It kind of moves us on to whether or not there are some examples of brands and supermarkets who are actually making food more affordable and sustainable. And how has NSF supported them?
I think if we look at the retailers, and I'll speak mainly from the UK, I think it's about providing the choice. We've looked at the range of evolution over the years, people bringing in value lines, value propositions. They still follow the brand standards of the organisation that's putting them out there. So most of the retailers have got a brand. We've had the rise of the European discounters, which do produce and put a good range of products, maybe not the extensive range that some of the retailers have, and that's how they help to manage that price point. Because ultimately at the moment, for a consumer to have choice, they need to have choice at a price that they can afford. If all the really nice stuff and all the best organic and everything is out of reach, we're not going to be able to move people towards where they want to be. So I think the retail sector in the UK certainly is putting a lot of effort into having affordable choices. That means that you can feed a family for whatever, feed for a £5, I think one of them was, up to Christmas. How can we give that choice and help people make those choices?
I mean, you give us a great opportunity to talk about some of our business practices and how we try to find efficiencies and always improve our services to our clients as well, right? Because a lot of what we do as a testing, inspection, and certification organization is deliver a lot of services to really large companies across the world. So also, how can we do that efficiently? When you're looking, for example, at why sustainable foods are more expensive, certification, yes, does play a part of that, because it puts an increased burden of record keeping, primarily. It's probably the most expensive part of certification in a way. And then there is also paying the certification cost on top of that. And so if we're able to find a way to scale the services that we're delivering to our clients literally all over the world, to do thousands and thousands of audits and inspections and write reports a year, that's one way that we're constantly innovating and looking at how we can make that scalable and more affordable for our clients. So then that can be a pass-through savings, ideally, on the shelf.
Scalable and more affordable. Of course, that's what everyone's after. But are they going to respond in a sustainably responsible way, do you think, Alison?
I think so, because in general, the consumer is starting to demand that. And the consumer is becoming much more aware of sustainability agenda, how do we look after our planet? And I think, the consumers have become much more aware of the impact of what they eat, what they buy, what they purchase, where they purchase, and what that could have. I look at my son, and he's like going, "Is that recyclable?" I would never have asked that when I was growing up. So I think as we get more mature as a population, understanding the impact of what we do, then it will grow. Some of us are still learning, and it's quite a journey. But as an industry, we're getting better at it. The scope has increased. We talk about welfare standards for animals. Is that sustainability? Is that food quality? Because when does welfare become the quality of the product as well? So they're all interlinked, and it's a journey that we're going on, and it's going to be an interesting ride for the next few years, I think.
And there's a big spotlight at the moment, especially in the UK, on the chicken industry. The spotlight really is about the big brands. Some of the big supermarket brands are selling chickens, a roast chicken for, in terms of pounds, and that's going to be something like £3 or £4 for a roasting chicken. And you kind of wonder, if some of the big branded supermarkets are able to sell roast chickens for that amount, where's the sustainability in that? Where's the animal welfare?
Yeah, it makes me think about scaled agriculture. If you have prices that are that low, generally speaking, you're probably not seeing like a larger access to open spaces like you would see now protected in the U.S. Or National Organic Program standards, for example. There's a certain amount of space that every living being really is guaranteed to have, right? And when you're looking at a more scaled conventional production system, you're looking at chickens that are probably in cages. I'm going to compare this in a way to actually strawberries. In conventional strawberry production, largely speaking, and I've been in these fields, I've smelled this in the air, you bomb the soil with methyl bromide, which is just something that will just completely kill everything in the soil and around. So it's actually fairly dangerous from a social perspective too. You cover the rows that the strawberries are going to be planted in. You do this before you plant the strawberries. So you kill everything inside the soil essentially, and you cover it up with plastic so it stays in there for a couple of weeks. And you pull all that up, and then you plant the strawberries, and you feed it all the nutrients that it needs. So it keeps it safer from funguses and things like that growing that would impact the yield. But it's kind of a hydroponic system at that point that's just completely synthetic. So I just kind of see some parallels between really cheap food, especially when it's a more protein intense kind of offering. It really does raise questions about the synthetic potential.
Oh yeah, I didn't know the background about that strawberry growing. It's absolutely fascinating, but that really speaks loudly about discounting and lower prices that actually bring their own risks and challenges to the planet. Alison, have you got any other similar examples like that where kind of discounting brings risks?
I come back to balance again, in that we talked about how you produce your products impacts the quality. So there is a balance that says actually we do want good welfare standards for chicken production, because actually if you don't look after them and you don't treat them well, you ultimately also can affect the yield, which is and how much you get. So I don't think it's as straightforward. Across the industry there will be bad actors, there will be people who don't follow the best standards. But as an industry, there's a lot of work going into welfare standards for all the meat lines that everyone does, and also you've got certifications for the fish industry as well. So I don't think it's all bad, but like anything, we can always do better. And I think most of the main retailers, food service, they look at that, and it's becoming much more part of their sourcing strategy to make sure that it's not just what we do when we turn it into the food, it's what we do to develop that product that goes into the factory to then be turned into a product. So I think there's a balance, and do we get that balance right all the time? Probably not, but we're trying to go in the right direction as an industry, and we support that with a lot of the welfare audits that we do. We do a lot of that in the UK and across Europe for welfare audits, both at slaughter, farm level, then in the factories as well.
And Lisa, you're seeing improvements, are you?
Well, yeah, one thing I wanted to comment on is that lower price point isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it can also result from production practices with a lot of integrity. And to a certain degree thinking of this like the secondary food market that's helping to reduce waste in the food system. So when you do see companies, I know here in the United States, called imperfect produce, just as one example, they're taking produce that might otherwise not go to supermarkets because the consumer has become so conditioned to just this perfect piece of fruit in front of them, right? So if it has any blemish, they don't necessarily want it. Well, understandably, you have grading then, right, in the produce industry. And so certain grocery stores, most of them will only take like the best looking ones, the A grades or, whatever is in their quality standards. And so then what happens to all that other fruit? Like there's times that farmers aren't even harvesting fields because maybe something's impacted the cosmetics of a particular crop of theirs, but actually the food is perfectly good to eat, right? So, but it's cheaper for them to not harvest and let it rot in the field because they don't necessarily have an end market for it. So I do think that you're seeing a lot of great business models coming up where they're being able to, I don't even want to say recycle or repurpose because the food is still good, but find that end market, right? And you might have a little bit lower price point on that, but it's a great way of avoiding a waste of food, which obviously helps feed the world more and reduces emissions and the use of all sorts of other resources that would be used to then regrow food because we didn't do it right the first time, right?
And I suppose things like wonky food and veg, Alison, that comes into that category, doesn't it?
I think in the UK there's actual marketing campaigns that say this isn't the perfect apple, this isn't the perfect potato, but if you buy this, it's a bit misshaped, but it's perfectly good to eat. There's been a lot of work in the UK on those areas.
Are people responding well to them though, or is the campaign just a bit half-hearted?
I don't think it's half-hearted. I think it takes a lot to change a mindset. It's like shifting the Titanic at times, moving people around past the iceberg. But I think the other piece that sort of Lisa mentioned is, we do have a lot of potential for waste. But from an industry, there's a lot more effort about how do you reduce that waste and more focus. So we talk about carcass balance with a lot of the meat products is, what can you do with it? Can you use it in different ways? We've certainly had Jamie Oliver in the UK who talks about how can we use different cuts of meat, use things differently. So I think, yes, we all like a perfect carrot that's really easy to peel, but the ones that are a bit wonky, they're still as usable. And so again, that's sort of is part of the education piece to improve things and use more of what we've got in totality.
Big question, of course, in everyone's mind is: do I go and shop local, or do I go online? Is it really better for the environment, and are we going to save money doing it?
This is a very complicated question. There's so many ways to dice and slice it. You really need to look at consumer behaviors in the home and how those might differ if you're ordering something online, perhaps in more precise amounts versus going to the store. Maybe your eyes are going to be bigger than your stomach at the store, right? It's such a layered question. And we talked earlier in the podcast about life cycle assessments and the power behind them because they can really help quantify the environmental impacts behind a product. But it's not necessarily just a product, it's about the system also, right? So is it more environmentally friendly? Are there less emissions if somebody were to have all of their food delivered in food kits versus raw ingredients or, starter ingredients from a grocery store, right? And have those delivered weekly? Or is it better to go once a week to the store and buy all of that yourself?
How do you shop? What do you do?
I personally like to go to the grocery store and look at everything on the shelf. I do just the lowest quantity I can in meal kits because, I work hard and some days I just it's too hard for me to think about what I want to cook. But overall, I love going grocery shopping. And it's fun to see new products on the shelf that you haven't seen before.
Am I right in saying that, even mostly in the US, the packaging is slightly less, and you can choose your fruit, you can pick your avocados, you can lift your bananas, and you don't have to have plastic around all of them. Is it better in the US than it is in the UK?
There are definitely clear examples of larger grocery chains responding to consumer pressure and environmental impact improvements to reduce packaging in produce. Trader Joe's did get a lot of good press because they were getting a lot of bad press that they had so much packaging involved with all of their produce. You couldn't buy a piece of produce from them basically without, taking it in a bag. So now they have a much wider variety of produce that they're offering that doesn't come in bags at all. So I think that's been a great change.
I don't think it's just plastic. I think it's also the type of packaging, because you can have mixed recyclables, and we've all got the thing. We look on the back of the pack, and there's three different ways you can deal with that packaging at the end. So I think there's a reduction. We've seen it with the cereal packets where they're all a little bit smaller. They've found ways now. You used to have the big air pocket at the top because that's how they filled them. We've now got slightly smaller packaging, so less cardboard. Unlike Lisa, I'm an online shopper. Most of the time I go on because it's quick. I know what I want to get. Do I get more waste? I'm not sure. I end up having to top up shop, and then I think I've got my waste about right, because I've not quite bought enough to get to my next online shop, but I'm not throwing anything out. So I think from me as a consumer, the online shop means that I can control how much I end up throwing away a little bit better.
Alison, can we go green if price is too high?
I think we can. I think it just slows it down. I don't think it stops the progress. I think as an industry, if we don't look at our sustainability options, how do we do everything greener, then in some cases, some industries, some parts of the industry may end up not being sustainable such that they disappear. So I think we can't stop progress, and it would be wrong to stop progress. I think the cost of living means that we've got to be ever more careful to make sure that what we do produce is affordable for the majority. Yes, there will always be the super duper innovative product that's aspirational, but I think the more we can do with what we eat day in, day out for everybody, putting the little wins in there is going to make a bigger difference than a single innovation.
So it's down to us all, but I'm hearing green shoots to going green. Thank you both for today's wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The speaker views are their own and may not necessarily reflect the views of NSF or any of its affiliates.